everybody. Welcome again to one of our monthly programs of the Rhinebeck Historical Society. Before I introduce our speaker, Bill Burns, this evening, just a couple of items that I want to share with you. December 14th, which is a Saturday evening, not a Friday evening, is our next gathering. There is a fee for that. It's $30. There are flyers way outside there on one of the tables if you haven't already signed up. And it's at the Rhinecliff Hotel. It's not dinner, but it's everything but. We didn't do it last year because I think, as you may remember, we had planned on doing it, but Tony Musso had an injury and wasn't able to do it, and we had to postpone Tony's program, and we didn't learn about that until very close to the event. So we're resuming those December gatherings. And our speaker is Bill Jeffway, the executive director of the County Historical Society, and he's doing a program on the history of suffrage in the county, specifically with a focus on Rhinebeck's role in women's suffrage, because it's the 100th anniversary of that major change in our national legislation. So now I am very happy to tell you that back in 2014, I attended a meeting that was over in Ulster County. It was the Ashokan Watershed Conference, and it was talking about a variety of issues related to water quality and the Catskills geology, and it was fascinating. And the major speaker at that conference was somebody who had been a high school teacher in the Margaretville School District for many years, I think for about 25 years, and also had taught in the Onteora School District for another 5 years. And he has maintained a blog about all issues related to Catskill for a number of years before that conference and since then. So that was 5 years ago, and it took me that much time to persuade my colleagues at the Rhinebeck Historical Society that it might make sense to hear about stuff going on the other side of the river. I mean, you know, when we talk about views and a view shed around here, we're not talking about this side of the river. We're talking about what we see across the Hudson. So it's high time that we hear from Bill Burns about what's going on over there and what's the history of that area. And so our board finally thought that might be a good idea. And so I got a hold of him, and he said, sure, I'd be glad to come and talk to you guys. And so here he is. Bill, we're delighted to have you here this evening. Thank you.
Thanks. It's always a good idea to hear about the Catskills. The Catskills are one of the great places in America, and I can make a case for all sorts of reasons why the Catskills are important, and I hope I do today. Make me feel right at home when I walk in the room of the Chancellor Livingston DUR. For about 19 years I lived in and raised my children in the little hamlet of New Kingston in Delaware County. New Kingston was founded by people who were burned out by the British in Kingston in 1777. And Chancellor Livingston, as the patron of the place, offered to the burned out residents of Kingston any 5,000 acres that they could find in his vast holdings in the Catskill Mountains. At that time, Chancellor Livingston had inherited from his father and grandfather thousands, hundreds of thousands, lots of acres of the Catskills. Somebody said that the Livingstons used to refer to the Catskills as our mountains, and indeed they were for many, many decades. But Chancellor Livingston offered this property. A guy named Van Benskoten, Jacob Van Benskoten, a very prominent local name out of Kingston, along with Samuel Cockburn, a surveyor who worked for Mr. Livingston, came up the pass that's now Route 28, over a hill, found this gorgeous valley, and decided this is it, this is New Kingston, claimed those 5,000 acres. So Chancellor Livingston's always been a very important figure in my life. And where I live now, in Armstrong Park in Fleischmans, New York, I live on property that once belonged to John Armstrong, married to Alida Livingston, and his home was Rokeby Farm. Now, I think in the Astor family, because Livingston married an Astor. So we share something in common on both sides of the river, which is Livingston's, and I'm glad we do. The Catskills, the thing that you've been, the view shed, if you will, to use a very contemporary word, the view shed that you see is the Catskill Mountains, which has been really a major kind of a brand name place for a couple of centuries now. When I say brand name place, what I mean is pretty much anywhere, if you say the Catskills or the Catskill Mountains, something conjures up in people's head. It might be the Borscht Belt, which is really a little bit south of the Catskills in Sullivan County. If you look at old films of Grossinger's, it's hard to see a hill, but was still called the Catskill Mountains. And so that may be the vision that people have, and that was a glorious time in the mountains, but there's always something. So I think that's important. And when the Catskill Mountains entered history, because history relies on the written record, the Catskill Mountain entered history in 1609, when the Half Moon under Henry Hudson came up the Hudson, and he had a crew member, his journal keeper, the log keeper on the Half Moon was a man named Robert Jouet. And Jouet would write in his journal every day about the progress of the trip. And he wrote this, and this is the first mention of that view shed that you've been looking at from this side of the river for I don't know how long now. The 15th in the morning was misty until the sun arose. Then it cleared. So we weighed with the wind at south and ran up the river 20 leagues, passing by high mountains. We had a very good depth at 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12, and 13 fathoms, and a great store of salmons in the river. This morning, our two savages got out of a port and swam away. After we were under sail, they called to us in scorn. At night we came on other mountains which lie from the river's side. There we found very loving people and very old men, where we were well used. Our boat went to fish and caught great store of very good fish. So those mountains that he mentions were the Catskills, which I always get a little lump in my throat when I'm coming up the thruway, and you get to that point somewhere south of the Kingston exit, and you first see the mountains, and it's like, whoa, there they are, and they're pretty impressive. Catskill Mountains were formed this way. They're mountains, but they were formed in kind of an interesting geological fashion. And we have to go back about 350 million years to get to the beginning of it, to the Devonian period. In fact, back about 1900, in a little town in Schoharie County, only a small portion of Schoharie County is in the Catskills, that sort of eastern southern portion, and western southern portion, excuse me. And in the town of Gilboa, there was a minister who was very interested in fossil hunting, which was very big back in the late 1800s, the early 1900s. And what he discovered was some fossils that the state museum people later came down, and what we had was, and they're still there, the oldest plant fossils on the planet. Certainly at the time, and I think still to this day. About 350 million years old. They're like rock, petrified stumps, pretty much, of what was once plant life. And it was aquatic plant life, because the whole place, both sides of the Hudson didn't exist 350 million years ago. Rather, there was a great inland sea. And as that sea, over millions and millions of years, as that sea began to recede, it formed a great delta coming out of what we now think of that west side of the river, even out of here, this great delta. And the delta, of course, would leave sediment, and that sediment would raise up the ground into a kind of plateau. And then when water would run down through that plateau, and later when we get to maybe 14, 15, 20,000 years ago, not millions now, when the glaciers came, the Ice Age, those glaciers ripped down what now are valleys of water and created these mountains. Notice the name, the Catskills. We were first settled by the Dutch, just as is true over here. And kill in the Dutch language is river, stream, creek. So the Catskills are really well named because yes, the Catskills are a mountain range and they are geologically part of the Appalachian mountain range. The Adirondacks are not. The Shungums are not. But the Catskills are part of the Appalachian range geologically. And it's also not just an area of mountains, it's really an area of rivers, of streams, of kills. They're well named because every mountainside has been carved out by a stream. And the streams of the Catskills, the Schoharie Creek, the Esopus Creek, the Batavia Creek, the Catskill Creek are very, very important things. Now, settlement in the Catskills, human habitation in the Catskills goes back about 10,000 years at least. I have a friend who is a former state trooper, former state beekeeper, amazing guy, who once placed in my hand a mortar stone from a mortar and pestle that would be used to crack nuts and that kind of thing. 10,000 years old, that stone, that had been used by paleo people way back in the day. And these were just small bands of people. Later, when we had European contact with the native people, we were able to, from that era, we're able to kind of outline who was who. And on the west side of the river, the people were called Lenni Lenape. They were a Munsee Algonquin language speaking group of people whom the English called Delawares because they liked to name things after famous people, and they had a guy named Lord Delaware, and they thought, wouldn't it be nice to name these people after Lord Delaware? But they called themselves the Lenni Lenape, and what's really cool, I like very much, is that Lenni Lenape translates to common people. So the people of the mountains were the common people. And if you've ever driven across the, I know you've driven across the Kingston-Rhinecliff Bridge, and you've gone up Route 28 at some point in your life, and as you go up Route 28, on the right-hand side of Route 28, you'll notice there's a ridge. And that ridge separates the Esopus Valley from the Schoharie Creek Valley. The Esopus was lands that were controlled by the Lenni Lenape, the Delaware Indians, if you will, the common people. Over the other side of that ridge, the Schoharie Creek, which is a tributary of the Mohawk River, was controlled by the Mohawks. The Mohawks, of course, are Iroquoian-speaking people. And anything but, they thought of themselves as anything but the common people. So, it was like, let's keep the Mohawks on that side of the ridge, and we Lenni Lenape, we're going to stay over here on this side of the ridge. There were no, as far as anybody's been able to determine, there were no permanent settlements in the Catskills among the native people. And the reason for that is the same reason why so many Catskill Mountain retirees go to Florida in the winter. It's the same thing. It's a hard place to make a living, the Catskills, first of all, still is to this very day. And it's harsh, long winters. So there were permanent, how do I want to put this? I would call them permanent seasonal settlements. So there was an archaeological dig done outside of Margaretville. I taught in Margaretville for 29 years. Margaretville's in Delaware County, very small school, graduated about 30 kids a year. And back in the 40s, an archaeological dig was done by locals, not by professional archaeologists, by locals, by regular guys and women, and discovered all sorts of implements right in this, what's called the Packatacken Flat, which is a flat between the east branch of the Delaware River and a brook called the Dry Brook, and another brook called the Bushkill. They all come in and meet that place, the perfect place. It's flat, it's fertile, so you could plant stuff there and then come back and get your harvest. Plenty of nuts and fruit and fish, and that would be where native people would come to spend the good weather. But when the winter came, people were down by the rivers again. So they were river people as opposed to mountain people, if that makes sense. Dutch settlement began on the west side of the river, pretty much the same as it began here on the east side of the river. So again, as you've gone to Kingston at some point, maybe you've come up Route 28 a little bit towards West Hurley and Woodstock, and if you look towards your left, there are these huge and rather impressive flats. They're known as the Esopus Flats. And the Esopus Flats, to this day, a matter of fact, when the fellow that does the Tonight Show now was doing his earlier comedic show where he was playing the right-wing commentator, what's his name again? Stephen Colbert. He did a bit when he had that former show where, in order to show the difficulty of life as a migrant agricultural worker, he went to work at Gill's Farm, which I think has just recently gone out of business, although I may be wrong. I think it's been bought up, and it's now, the fields are being, it's going to take 5 years to turn those fields into organic producing fields. But I believe those fields, and I hope, but I really do believe that those fields will be producing agricultural products into the way distant future, just as they have from the way distant past. And so the Dutch settlers, found that place to be a great place to be. So they had their little stockade town of Kingston. They had the Hurley, Old Hurley, where all those stone houses are, and those great flats. And the reality is that the native people and the European people worked side by side, plot to plot, no problem. Till alcohol kind of stuck its nose in. And a couple of Indians got a snootful, and somebody got killed, or a fight broke out, and all of a sudden we had, boom, a war about 1740. And that sort of led to a real period of conflict, where that period of everybody getting along was kind of coming to an end. And the native peoples had kind of receded from the Catskills, certainly by the time of the Revolution. The big date for the reason why these became our mountains, if we were all Livingstons, is 1708. In 1708, there was a thriving settlement in Esopus on those flats, and what they wanted in the early part of the 1700s was more land up in the hills, particularly to get wood. They had pretty well tapped out their fuel resource, and they were looking for woodlots in the mountains. And many would go up and just, squat, claim that land, but nobody got it legally. So they were applying to the governor of New York, Governor Cornbury, who was a cross-dresser, just an interesting sidelight, and
how can you tell?
Beautiful Chicago. They were ignored by him, but a fellow named Hardenberg, who had several partners, about 7 or 8 partners. I know there's the 9 partners patent. Well, this patent had a lot of partners too. Applied to the governor for a patent on the west side of the river, for a land grant on the west side of the river. And in 1708, he got the governor on his side, and the Hardenberg Patent was granted by Queen Anne, 4 million acres west of the river. Now, all the real settlement that had already happened, the patroon settlement of the Dutch, had happened on the east side of the river. As you know, a patroon ship was, 100, whatever the measurement was in those days, 100 miles, whatever it was, along the riverbank, and then everything back. So these guys now have the Hardenberg Patent, and like anybody who comes up with an asset to this day, now wants to monetize that asset, right? Wants to see if they can make some money off that asset. But in order to do that, you've got to have surveyed plots to sell those plots. You've got to have, roads and access and stuff. And the Hardenberg people were never really ever to pull that together. So even though this Hardenberg Patent was a very impressive landholding on the map, in the actual world, they never really were able to turn that into something. And they, these guys got to the point where they were ready to get out. And in about late 1730s, early 1740s, Robert Livingston, I think this would be Robert Livingston of Claremont, the second Robert Livingston, purchased. Pennies on the acre. Pretty much the whole thing. And, to his credit, he and his son in about, I think, 1742 went up into that land themselves to kind of start the survey process and see what they have. So he wasn't just let me sit down here in the chair and look at what I've got. He actually went out there and got into it. And they also got a guy involved named John Bartham, who was a botanist, and he went into the mountains looking for plants that might have important medicinal values. We knew that the native people had used plants in this way extraordinarily, and the idea was maybe you could monetize make a profit off this land through those kinds of things. And that continues to this day. One of the important exports of the Catskills is ginseng. Today there's a couple of companies, but one particularly that is attempting to organize the essentially industrial growth of ginseng. And I'm told, I have never been to China, but I'm told that if you go to China and you go up to a seller of ginseng and you say Catskill ginseng, he knows what it is, and he's got it right over there. That's how impressive that is to a culture that finds and what ginseng is it's a root that must be dried and shaved and all sorts of things, and then it's ingested by mouth daily. And it's not something that gets you high or anything like that. It's rather something that gives a generalized feeling of well-being. And Chinese and many Asian cultures swear by this stuff. There's been a long time attempt by Catskill Mountain entrepreneurs to try to get a market for ginseng in the United States. And while you can find it on the shelf in the nutrition stores, it hasn't really hit. During the American Revolution, there was only moderate number of settlements. There was a settlement at Margaretville, near where I live. There was no settlement in Fleischmans, where I live presently. The settlement in New Kingston I talked about earlier, and there's a settlement in Shandaken, wasn't existing yet. So just a few handful of settlements. Woodstock, Shandaken, not that many actual settlements at the time of the Revolution. And most of the Catskill Mountain folk on that side of the river were struggling yeoman farmers, subsistence farmers, and they sided largely with the Loyalists. One of the motivators for our founding father, and that's how I look at Chancellor Livingston, that's a kind of an old-fashioned phrase. We're more comfortable today calling our founders, but Jefferson and Madison and Washington and Chancellor Livingston were our founders. All those other guys were from Virginia. Adamses were from Massachusetts. Livingston was from up the road. So we really ought to be very proud of him. And of course we know that Chancellor Livingston swore in George Washington to the oath of office, the same oath of office that is used today. And I'm going to tell you something else he did in just a minute. During the Revolution, most people were feeling a little bit more loyalist, whereas the people who thought they had more to lose, there was a real rumor going around, to my understanding, that just like Elizabeth Warren is talking about a wealth tax, there were people in England talking about a direct land tax. So if you're paying a tax per acre and you own $1 million, you're really not going to be that comfortable with that government. So that was one reason. There were economic reasons as well as, the liberty reasons for the wealthy founders to decide they wanted to revolt. So one of the figures that comes into our story is Joseph Brant, who would raid the western parts of the Catskills, the Schoharie Valley, was the breadbasket of America at that time. Today, Schoharie is a great place to go to buy potatoes and squash and tomatoes and onions. But in them there days, it was wheat. And so controlling that breadbasket was very important. And so Brant and Loyalists and I think a guy named Colonel Butler, who was a redcoat, were involved in a lot of raids out there, which turned the people of the Catskills against the British. And it became then more of a hotbed of independence. As soon as the revolution was over, everybody who fought in that revolution wanted a piece of land. I've been reading this book by Jill Lepore. She's a wonderful writer, professor at Harvard. She writes in the New Yorker. One of the few people that can both be a professor and write. And she not only has written a great one-volume history of the United States, first one ever written by a woman, called We Hold These Truths, which is, it's great because she says things like, I'm off topic here for a minute, but you got to read this book. She says things like, in the late 18th century, 1787, there were two revolutions in America. One was for political independence from Britain. The other was for freedom for the enslaved people. One succeeded. And once you start including everybody in history that way, boy, it changes the way we read history a lot. Well, anyway, this other book she wrote called King Philip's War, very similar kind of war to the one I described in the Esopus, a war that broke out over drinking, basically. You know, guys like to go to a bar and get in a fight. So that's been that way for hundreds of years. So, and how when the native peoples raided the English and burnt down their property, this is her thesis, an Englishman felt like an Englishman because he owned property. If you didn't own property, if all the property was destroyed, what am I now? And that's had kind of a great effect, according to Jill's thesis on our psyches. Anyway, my point is this: when the Papacton Reservoir was built for the New York City water supply, it was built in the late 40s, early 50s. There were 3 villages that had to be abandoned. They took the entire west branch of the Delaware River and turned it into a series of 3 reservoirs. And starting in 1938, agents would start coming to houses and knock on doors to tell people they should be prepared to lose their property to eminent domain. In every house that they knocked on, every house that was on the west branch of the Delaware River, there was at least 1, sometimes 2, and often as many as 4 veterans of the Revolution in that farm family's family tree. And if you think about it, after the Revolution, I want to get mine now. I fought, I carried the musket, now I'm going to get my piece of property that I can farm, and what's the best property? On the river. Now we've learned, and climate change has kind of given us a right and a left, that on the river gets flooded. But on the river gets flooded also makes for fertile ground. So all that river, the west branch of the Delaware, the east branch of the Delaware, all those hills and rivers that run through the Hudson, or through the Catskills, that was the land that went first. And at that time, after the Revolution, there was a great immigration from Scotland. Border Scots, on the borderlands between the Highlands and the Lowlands. I'm not sure exactly what was going on in Scotland, but it couldn't have been good, because people were leaving, and many came to the Catskills and established farms in the Catskills. And some of those farms, where I moved to the Catskills in 1971, and there were, in New Kingston, the town that Chancellor Livingston really founded, there were 8 working dairy farms at that point, and I think pretty much all of them, or maybe 6 out of the 8, could trace the ownership of that farm back 5 and 6 generations, where that same land had been passed down time after time after time. The farming has kind of gone out in many places, but it was still very big at that time. So, it's a big Scottish immigration. We're in the mountains. It's isolated. The mountains tend to create their own community separate from other communities because of the isolation of the mountains. A big change to that was the railroad, which I'll talk about in a minute, and lately it's the SUV, which has made the mountains that much more accessible. And today in Delaware County, Ulster County, Greene County, certainly the town in which I live, about 60 to 70% of the houses in our towns are vacant Monday through Friday. They're second homes for urban people. And what I found is if you don't go to Florida and you're looking to get a sandwich in the Catskills on a Tuesday, good luck. 1817, we just celebrated the 200th anniversary 2 years ago. Washington Irving, the first writer in America to build a reputation that held up in Europe, a reputation where Europeans were saying, this guy can write, he's funny, he's good, this is great. He writes a story called Rip Van Winkle, and he sets the story in the Catskill Mountains. And we all know the story, and we all know how Rip was a kind of a wastrel husband, and how Rick was, didn't work very hard, and how Rip went up with his fowling piece and his dog, and how he got drunk with these magical little dwarf Dutchmen, and they were Dutchmen, and how the thunder was the sound of the ball that rolled in the mountains, and this whole mythology built up, which gave the Catskills a kind of sense of mystery, yes, but also of a kind of, who were those little people in the Irish forests? Kind of a leprechaunish sense to the Catskills. Sign of this that there's magic in those hills. And you'll notice that there are real estate agents who are still using that kind of a sales pitch to get people to come buy in the mountains. There's magic in those hills. And that really was born with Rip Van Winkle. And in the 19th century, I can make a case that the Catskill Mountains were first in pretty much anything you want to name. Certainly, the Catskills were one of the first places to establish the idea of an American vacation. And that happened in 1820 when a man named Charles Beach put up the Catskill Mountain House. And this was a big, beautiful hotel on a precipice overlooking the Hudson lowlands. And how many people have ever been up to North-South Lake?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the beautiful thing about it, that this place with all of the trails and the two lakes and the views that used to be the province only of the rich now belong to all of us. And I say only of the rich because the Catskill Mountain House was expensive, maybe $2, $3 a day, which was a lot of money when the average person might be making $1 a day, the working person. And the Catskill Mountain House became legendary and led to the establishment right there on the mountaintop of the Laurel House and what was the other one called? It's escaped. The Hotel Catskill. And then this growth of hotels. But Charles Beach was a very good businessman, and he knew that his brand wasn't Mountain House. It was Catskill Mountain House. And therefore, the Catskills were the mountains immediately around Hunter. Now, Hunter Mountain, today we know, is the second tallest, the second highest mountain, second highest elevation in the Catskills. At that time, it was considered the highest. And the only mountains that were considered the Catskills were those mountains that were around the mountain house. And if anybody else tried to use that word Catskills, I don't know if Beach sued, but he did whatever he could do to get a cease and desist order to stop doing that. So other parts of the Catskills might be called the Blue Mountains, the Shandaken Mountains out in the west towards where I live. But don't call them the Catskill Mountains because that belonged to Mr. Beach, or at least he thought so. That eventually kind of faded as three things happened in the 1870s that were huge. Number one, the railroad came in. And You know, the Mr. Kuykendall from Kingston and the Cornell Ferry Company, or it was a whole kind of Kingston-centric enterprise in which they built the railroad that goes from Kingston up to High Mount and then swung around, eventually went all the way to Oneonta. That brought people into the western, what we now call Catskills, mountains that, is that really the Catskills? I don't know. Is that the Catskills? I'm not sure. Second thing happened. A Princeton geologist named Arnold Guyot, I can't pronounce his name very well, but it's Guyot, so I say Guyot. He, I've never heard it said, I just read it. He comes up here every summer and starts doing geological work, including elevation measurements, altimeter measurements. And what he discovers is that the mountaintop, and we still call it the mountaintop today, up there by Hunter and Wyndham in that area, the mountaintop is not the highest point in the Catskills. The highest point in the Catskills is Slide Mountain. And Slide Mountain is in the west southern part of the Catskills. Ooh, that took a little bit of the shine off of Mr. Beach's brand. And then a Catskill Mountain native, a young man who grew up in Roxbury, New York, in the western slope of the Catskills, grew up on a dairy farm because dairying was the only kind of farming that made sense in the mountains. You could grow grass much better. You could grow anything else. You could grow corn. You could feed cows. And you could sell butter. And butter from the mountains was a real delicacy. In fact, a number of years ago, I was watching a program some of you have seen. It was about the birth and death of Penn Station in New York City. It was on PBS. And they were showing the Tenderloin area where Penn Station, that they had ripped apart, the neighborhood they ripped up to put in Penn Station back in 1910. And there, a sign on one of the stores, Delaware County Butter. Over the door of the store. That was how important that product was. So John Burroughs climbed Slide Mountain and then wrote a essay, and he was becoming more and more of a popular essayist in the Atlantic magazine and Scribner's magazine and Century magazine. And by the mid-1880s, early 1890s, he was becoming more and more famous. More and more of his essays were being written. He was always writing about nature, the outdoors, a simple life, living in harmony with nature, local food, all that kind of stuff. And he writes an article about climbing up Slide Mountain, and that caught people's attention. So those three events kind of, all of a sudden, we're starting to see that the Catskills are much bigger than what people had, what Charles Beach had tried to kind of limit ourselves to. During the 19th century, the Catskills became largely responsible, I think, for the first American indigenous painting art in our country, called the Hudson River School. We call it the Hudson River School, but so much of the subject matter and of the whole idea behind the Hudson River School was, and just think of a Hudson River School picture in your head, nature big, people little. Pretty much the whole idea that, get this through our heads, get used to it. Nature's bigger than we are. And maybe one of my favorite paintings is the one called Kindred Spirits, which shows Thomas Cole, the painter who started all this, and William Cullen Bryant standing at the top of the Catskill Falls. And not falling, because we know that place can get dangerous. So, part of the Catskills is this expanding notion of what the Catskills are. So early, where I live in the town of Fleischmans, was a precursor to what we know of as the Borscht Belt. Sometimes people refer to it as the Schnitzel Belt. Because what happened was in 1876, a banker named Joseph Seligman, he was the Jamie Dimon of his era. He's one of the major bankers on Wall Street. He is an extremely successful man. He has a beautiful family, and every year they go to the Grand Union Hotel in Saratoga to spend their summer. And so he is in the lobby of the Grand Union Hotel in Saratoga Springs with his 2 daughters dressed to the nines, his wife looking lovely, their suitcases and trunks piled up. When the manager comes over and says, "I'm sorry, Mr. Seligman, we don't take Hebrews." Took us last year. "Sorry, Mr. Seligman, there's been a change." Whoa, man, did that ripple through the community. So a man named Charles Fleischman, who owned a yeast company in Cincinnati, company's still around, it's been around for 150 years. You've used Fleischman's yeast, you may even have drank a little Fleischman's vodka or a little Fleischman's whiskey. It's the stuff on the bottom shelf. They didn't make no Chivas Regal. No, just kidding. He comes east, maybe with a little respiratory problem, you know, doctor said get some fresh air. Comes east, stops in a place called Griffin's Corners, likes it, buys 60 acres, puts his compound on the top where he has 5 houses, one for him, one for his brother, one for his sister-in-law, you know, the whole family. And now the Fleischman's family, one of the premier Jewish families in America, and Mr. Fleischman had just emigrated in 1866, so you know, he made it fast in this country, was now in Fleischman's, and that started bringing Jewish people from New York City who were looking for a vacation flocking to Fleischman's. So in the 1890s and early 1900s, Fleischman's became a center of vacations. And that kept happening in the Catskills. So in my previous life, when my kids were little, we used to go to the Irish Catskills. Their mother is the daughter of Irish immigrants, and so we would go to East Durham. And I can remember sitting up on the porch there next to this lovely nun who was vacationing there as well, and she was talking. This was in the 1980s, and she was talking about the illegal immigrants that come to my parochial school. I don't even ask for papers anymore. There's so many of them. And this was when there was all sorts of problems. You may remember Iran-Contra and all that, all sorts of problems in Central America. I said, "Sister, where are they coming from? El Salvador, Nicaragua?" "Oh, no, Ireland." But that's what happened in the Catskills. There was an Irish Catskills up there in East Durham. There was an Italian Catskills around Cairo. There was a German Catskills up Oliveria. There was a Peg Leg Bates had his place. There was another place called Friendship Manor out towards me, which were African American resorts. And so back in the days when people only liked to be with people who came from the same country that their parents came from, when we were more, everybody was more of an immigrant. There was a place for every group to go in the Catskills. In fact, one of the really interesting stories, and now I'm really getting off track, was this guy was in an antique shop in Greenwich Village, and he comes upon this cache of photographs of people who were obviously men, dressed in women's clothing, sitting around playing canasta, chit-chatting, their photographs, and everybody's dressed to the nines with a handbag and the whole 9 yards. And when he does some research, he finds out that there was a resort in Hunter where before any of this stuff became fashionable, men could go up for the weekend. No sex was involved. Nobody was interested in that. It was just dress as a woman, act like a woman for Saturday and Sunday, pack those clothes away and go back home. There was a resort for everybody in the Catskill Mountains. So when Jenny Grossinger, down in Sullivan County, and I have to tell you that my son, who grew up in New Kingston, went down to college in Pennsylvania, in East Stroudsburg, and he said, when the teachers were having him introduce himself, this other young woman says, "I'm from the Catskill Mountains." And so my son approaches her afterwards and said, "Well, where are you from?" She goes, "Monticello." "That's not the Catskill." But when those flatter lands in Sullivan County, and that's where Jenny Grossinger had her farm, she and her husband, when they started taking in boarders, everybody was taking in boarders. The aforementioned Joe Hewitt I mentioned earlier, his parents had a farm. His father always said, "I never made a nickel farming," but he did pretty well taking in summer boarders. And Joe, who's now 80 years old, tells a story of sleeping in the corner in an attic or in the basement or in the kitchen because his room and every other room in the house has been taken from the family to rent out. There's a great book, if you're interested in more on the Catskills. There are two books that I would recommend. One, of course, is the sort of the standard, the most well-known Catskill Mountain book by the inimitable Alf Evers, died at 99 years old over in Woodstock, New York. Alf wrote The Catskills from Wilderness to Woodstock, this thick, published in 1972, and not really out of date because what Alf really did was tell stories. So the book is full of stories, and the stories are engaging stories that give you a real sense of what the mountains are all about. If you want something that gives more of a sort of a theme, thesis-driven approach to what makes the Catskill Mountains matter, there's a great book by a University of Cincinnati professor, David Stradling's his name. The book is called The Making of Mountains. Stradling's thesis is that mountains are provided by nature or God, but what we make of them, how we understand them, how we conceptualize them, that's human, that's us, we do that. And his thesis essentially is that the Catskills have always provided for visitors whatever visitors are looking for at any given time. So, today, preparing to come down here, I watched some YouTube videos, and one was about the Borscht Belt resorts. Literally hundreds of people around the swimming pool. Hundreds of people. I mean, I think most of us would feel a little bit claustrophobic. And what were those people looking for? Two things: food and fun. So it was a big breakfast followed by Simon Says, and then it was a big lunch followed by volleyball, and then, you know, and so there's another thing, entertainment, that the Catskills has been a tremendous contributor to. So the tumbler, which is a Yiddish phrase for the MC, the jester, the guy who, you know, the social director, if you will. He was, you know, that was the start of the career for Sid Caesar. That was a start for Danny Kaye. Probably the last well-known entertainer to start his career in the Catskills was Seinfeld, who began his career up there. So what they had to do down there in the flatter lands of the northern Sullivan County was convince people that the Catskills had expanded once again. Remember, it was just Mr. Beach's mountaintop, and believe me, there's still some people on the mountaintop who think they're the only ones in the Catskills. And then there's, you know, the stretch down to where around Slide Mountain, the Shandakins, and back in the western part, back where I am, and now we're going down to the Borscht Belt, and that's taking that, because nobody's going to go for a vacation let's go for a vacation in northern Sullivan County. That doesn't sound like much fun. We're going to the mountains. At one time, there were 900 resorts in the Catskills, in the Borscht Belt Catskills. Not the whole Catskills, just that area down there. And that area took resorting to new heights, because indoor swimming pool and an outdoor swimming pool, indoor skating rink, golf course, tennis course. I remember my aunt and uncle would go to some of these places and they would play golf. They never played golf in their lives, but on vacation you play golf. Stradling, The Making of Mountains, his thesis is whatever people are looking for, the people of the Catskills are going to give them. So in the Borscht Belt, they're looking for entertainment and food. There was a time people were looking for fresh milk and fresh air and fresh water. We'll give it to them. Today, the young people, the Catskills are hot, very hot among young people. I like to drive down to Livingston Manor. It's a beautiful drive. About, I don't know, it takes me about 30 minutes to get down there. And when I get down there, I know exactly where to go. All sorts of people in skinny pants. It's like the entire youth organization of Williamsburg, Brooklyn, has moved up to Livingston Manor. Because what are young people looking for? Local food. Right? You know where your food comes from. Make sure it's pure and clean, all that kind of stuff. I've watched hunting. It's always been big in the Catskills. I've watched, you know, where the hotels proudly hang the deer out in front of the hotel. I've lived there 50 years now. Where the hotels hang the deer out front, so they're advertising, you know, you want to get a deer, come stay at our place. Then they were hanging the deer in the barn because if anybody saw a deer hanging outside, they'd throw red paint on it. And today, a couple of years ago, there were signs on the side of the road that said, "We deer hunter, donate your deer to feed the people that occupy Wall Street." And today, many hunters are now, not to occupy Wall Street, but are donating deer. The DEC is now, this is, I think, brilliant. When the DEC talks about hunting now, they're talking about 11 million pounds of fresh organic meat, a New York State resource. Again, whatever people are looking for, the Catskill Mountains will give them. I'm going to take some questions now. We're a little bit into it, so if there's anything I didn't cover or anything you'd like to ask me about or whatever, please do. So who's got a thought? Yes, sir.
Are the old Borscht Belt resorts being repurposed today?
Not so much. They're actually many of them are being torn down. What happened down in Monticello was the Concord property was purchased by Resorts World. And rather than repurpose the Concord Hotel, they tore all that down and built a whole new thing. So right now in Monticello, there is the Resort World Casino, which was just sold again to an international casino company. They're having a little trouble getting, you know, we may have over-casinoed. There may be more casinos than there's a need for. But they also put in, this is really cool, they also put in this indoor water park called the Cartwright, which you may have seen advertised, which is a resort. It's not like the Zoom Flume where you go for the day. It's you rent a room and you take your kids and it's like a Disneyland water park kind of thing. So I think the idea was the adults would be gambling while the kids would be playing. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I understand at one time there were major hemlock forests.
Oh, yeah, I wanted to talk about tanning for a little bit. One of the things about the Catskills, you remember, the description of the Catskills that Washington Irving offers in the beginning of Rip Van Winkle, where the glow of the light and all that, they look blue, because the major forest in the Catskills was hemlock. The Catskills were, in many ways, a mono forest. One species dominated, and that was the hemlock. Hemlock provides some of the finest concentration of tannins in order to turn hides into leather. Sometime in the 1830s, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, a man named Zadoc Pratt went up to the Schoharie Creek and established a town, today called Prattsville, named after him, and established the largest tannery in the world. Tanning is a smelly business, and New York tanning used to take place in the area. My father was in the leather business, and his office was on Gold Street down in downtown New York by Maiden Lane and William Street, and that Gold Street was kind of destroyed in 1958 or 61 by a new entrance to the Brooklyn Bridge. But they weren't doing tanning down there anymore. They were just doing the brokering, the buying and the selling of the leather products, of raw leather. Because tanning, you don't want tanning in the city whenever you can get rid of it. So Pratt had this huge tannery, employed hundreds of people, employed hundreds of bark peelers. They used to say a bark peeler was a guy who would go out in July. In July, the heat or whatever it is loosens the bark on a hemlock tree. And so the bark peelers would go out, they would score that hemlock tree all the way around and then peel, that's the name bark peelers, peel the bark off of it. The bark would be loaded up on a wagon and then taken down. That bark provides the tannin, bark and water, to tan the leather. That killed the hemlock trees. And so one could look upon the tanning, and traditionally people have looked upon the tanning industry as kind of, you killed all the hemlock trees. But recently I heard a guy make a very interesting proposition. I think he's got a real good point, which is a monoforest is an unhealthy forest. A forest that depends on hemlock trees is not good. We want a mixed forest. And the forest that replaced that hemlock forest is a mixed forest with birch beech, maple, black cherry predominating, as well as some spruce and hemlock and so on. But there were tanneries all over the Catskills. The other great product I wanted to talk about in the Catskills, and I told you, there's so much in the Catskills, there's just not enough time, is bluestone. The bedrock in the Catskills is sedimentary. It's sandstone, because I told you, remember about that delta, how it was all the accretion of sediment that built these mountains? So the sandstone and shale, which takes on a lovely blue patina, it became a major export out of the Catskills. Most of the first sidewalks in New York, Philadelphia, major cities were Catskill Mountain bluestone. Ulster County was huge in that, just outside of Kingston. A lot of bluestone. There's Onteora Lake up there. It's just an old bluestone quarry. It's been played out and is now a lake. Now the bluestone industry has moved to Pennsylvania. It's kind of because we've tapped out our bluestone. It's kind of gone down around Montrose. But there is still a bluestone industry because bluestone is still a product that people want. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, you started off speaking about the view
Yeah,
of the other side of the river.
yeah.
Last time I knew, 20 years ago, a lot of that land is owned by the Catholic Church.
Yeah, not anymore. What happened was, what you were looking at was Mount SaintAlphonsus in Esopus. Is probably pretty much directly across here. Big, huge, beautiful building. That was the seminary for the Redemptionist Fathers. There aren't too many.
But a lot of the just vacant land.
I'm not sure about that. If it is, you could probably pick it up. I mean, they could use money right now.
Oh,
to tell you
that's
the
the
truth.
thing.
They're having
That's
some
the
money
thing.
problems lately.
That's the thing.
Yeah.
But also, has anyone ever tried, Mike, you might know about this, just making an agreement across the river, because we're all in the Greenway. Both sides of the river are in the Hudson River Valley Greenway. But making an agreement, a handshake, okay, I won't pollute your side of the river if you don't pollute mine. Has anybody tried that?
Oh, I think so. I think that, the Hudson, I forget what the organization is called, but something that has Hudson,
Scenic
they work
Hudson.
both sides of the river, Scenic Hudson, all of those organizations. Recently, some of the brickworks in Kingston have been purchased, and they're going to create something like 590-acre park right on the river. So certainly the impetus today, not just from an environmental standpoint, but from an economic standpoint. I think what people have discovered is that the river draws people. And so, for example, the success of, nobody knew that the walkway across the Hudson was going to be as successful as it is. Everybody thought, isn't that a wonderful idea? Isn't that great? We owe a debt of gratitude to people who worked so hard to make it happen. But nobody envisioned that it was just going to be packed all the time. So I think what that tells us is that, green on a river sells. And so they're really, the impetus is now to, instead of developing on the river, try to develop parkland and so on. Yeah.
Any
Yes,
other-
sir.
In the back.
Is it true that there's a river under the Hudson River with fresh water flowing just?
That I don't know. I mean, the river is the Hudson is a tidal river, so by the time the water's up here, I imagine that there is some combination of salt water and fresh water that could make it seem, someone could see that as a separate river if the fresh water is in this area, the salt water up here. But I'm really,
They used to take water from the river to Aruba,
yeah.
and outside of Esopus there's, I call it springs, but the tankers used to fill up with water.
Yeah, the regulations on their being able to do that.
But that might have been
have
ballast.
changed.
That was
Yeah.
probably ballast. In other
They were
words,
selling water.
Huh?
They were selling water.
they were selling water?
South of the
I think
border.
what the question refers to is that at one time, tankers that would deliver oil products, whatever products up in Albany, would discharge that, come down, back down the river, north of where the salt line is, which generally used to be about where we are, north of Rhinecliff, where the Rondout comes in, and would fill up with water, and many of those tankers would sell that fresh water in the West Indies, where water is a much more precious resource. But there are regulations now that, limits on how much of that can occur. But to answer your initial question about anything underneath the bottom of the Hudson River, one of the things that's under the bottom of the Hudson River is the aqueduct that connects the various reservoirs that Bill was talking about, the Packin, Shokan, whatever, that feed New York City. In order to be able to feed New York City, that water has to get across the river, under the river, over into the Katona Reservoir, and eventually into New York City. And that's under the river, right around where, I think it's between Poughkeepsie and Newburgh, and it's a rather large hole underneath the river. Whether there's any other fresh water underneath the Hudson River, I'm not aware of it, but it could well exist. Any other questions?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
You've heard the other name for the Borscht Belt,
What's that?
the Jewish Alps?
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. Anybody
Bill?
else have a thought?
Yeah, many thanks.
Thank
I
you.
guess the short version is there actually